Hi.
Where are we? What is going on here? What's this
Oh,
background?
weird. It's all new. Are we lost?
I don't know. I
How'd we
just
get
kind
in
of
here?
recognize this place.
We
Dark
got
wood.
some new digs.
We got some
Yay.
new digs. Yep.
Let us know what you think. We thought we would make it nice and homey, and we love the wood. And
yeah,
Richard built this actually.
My brother did actually.
Oh, really? Oh,
My
sorry,
brother.
Pat.
Yeah, Pat did it. Yeah, he did a really
Sorry.
good job.
It's
So anyway,
fantastic.
we're happy to be here. It's fun. I'm thinking that the weather's going to start getting warm at some point.
Ooh, that's what the report says.
Yeah.
I mean,
can you believe him though?
No, I
Yeah.
don't actually.
Yeah, I know it's ridiculous.
I'm so mad. The number of times I've heard, I don't pay California taxes for Oregon weather.
Exactly.
All right, it's getting old.
Yeah.
We're all sick of it.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for sunshine this weekend. I can't wait.
I actually think we're there. I think it's going to be like shifting into the 80s. We're going to be good.
Ugh, hallelujah. You know, my
That's what I
daughter,
think.
my 4-year-old, has her very first dance recital.
Oh.
She's in like a Little Mermaid production.
How cute.
So
Does she have like a tutu and everything?
Oh my God. It's like a whole fish out. She's a singing fish. So it's a
Wow.
whole outfit with the hair and glitter all over her face and feathers and sequins. And she is
just reveling in it.
And I'm like, how did I become a dance mom? Like, when did this happen? Yikes. But we have to spend all day indoors because, for her performance, we're in Antioch, there's hair and makeup. And I'm like, when are we going to get
flowers?
outside?
Make sure you give her flowers, a bouquet of flowers.
Yes,
got to do that.
Yep. Kid flowers. I completely forgot about that.
It'll come back to haunt you. They'll be in therapy about it because you didn't do it. When they're older.
You know what? She's going to therapy about something. It might as well be my mom forgot flowers one time. Like that's the easiest thing that's happened.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to A Place of Possibility. We are happy to have you here. I am Richard DelMonte.
I'm Angela Wright. Thanks for being here.
Yep. So what are we talking about today, boss?
Okay. Today I'm super excited. We have a guest, an amazing estate planning attorney. I am thrilled to talk to her. She's got some great information for everybody. But first, we're going to take a moment to talk about the debt ceiling.
Oh, you mean that big axe hanging over our heads right now?
Seems like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So, what's going on has definitely happened before. The government is allowed to borrow up to a certain amount of money. That threshold is set by Congress. And, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is out here saying, hey, we're approaching this debt limit. And if Congress does not say, okay, yes, the U.S. government can borrow more money and raise that debt ceiling by June 1st, we're facing potential shutdowns, inability to pay our bills, right? So that means Treasury bill and bondholders will not receive interest or repayment of face amount, Social Security payments, furloughs for government workers,
military.
Yes, that's your military.
Yep.
That's your state offices. Yep. There's a lot of people.
Yep.
And you may remember furloughs of the past. This has happened before.
Yep. And that's just to name a few of the people and groups that will be impacted. Mm-hmm. Suffice it to say, it could unleash global chaos worldwide, and that's not really an exaggeration, because it could also damage our standing in the world, because we are the currency that everybody's denominated in. All the oil changes hands in dollars, and we're kind of the world's backup currency, and so that could change if we end up becoming the freaks that'll default on a whim.
Right. Right.
And so that's a real problem. And at the very least, it will just increase the cost of our borrowing for the government even more. And heaven knows we're in debt $31 trillion already. And if you raise that 0.5%, imagine what that does to the budget. So, it's not good.
And it's a little scary for, us, you and me, because we have no control over this. Right. It's Congress who is deciding, and they're all in there doing their usual thing. And I think, now we're more polarized than ever, and we have more characters on the floor than we ever have before. It's looking more like UK Parliament, right, than it ever has before.
They're just not screaming,
exactly.
Yelling.
Wait for it. I'm sure it's coming, right?
It's coming,
and so
right.
it tensions have been high, and it is a little bit testy this time. Like,
yep.
What are they going to do?
Yeah. And the reason Congress would, risk having a default is because the party out of power sees it as a leverage point to be able to extract whatever they want out of the party that's in power. Mm-hmm. Right now, the Republicans want to extract, budget reductions, which is really kind of interesting, because when they were in power, and they didn't want to give that. So, it goes back and forth.
Totally.
It's not really a Republican Democrat thing. It's the way it works in DC. So, it's not good, but it creates this gigantic game of chicken that's been going on. And more than likely, it'll go down to the last few days. But in the meantime, as we get closer to the deadline, they're thinking they're going to run out of money on June 1st, according to Yellen. So as we get closer, if it's not resolved and everybody's talking big trash talk and everything, the markets could start declining. I wouldn't be surprised to see it. It's happened before.
Sure.
But I think most people right now, the markets were 3 weeks out, and most people in the markets are like, whatever, because they think it's going to get resolved, because it always has been in the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Right. And so, of course, the media is going to have an absolute field day with. They get 3 weeks of just premium content to scare the living daylights out of you, sell the heck out of that ad space. Like, this is the best thing to ever happen, to bloggers, people like us, right?
The chattering class is what they're called.
Talk about. And investors are sitting here going, well, should I do something before it gets really bad? Like, what do I do? Right.
Which is why we encourage our clients to actually think about their investments as a bright spot of relief in an otherwise unmanageable world. Because of all the things you cannot control, your investment portfolio is something that you can call your own shots in. And so having a well-structured, globally diversified investment portfolio is really important.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And more good news, you've heard us say this before. I feel like I'm repeating myself all the time. You don't need to know, you really as an investor don't need to know the day-to-day back and forth of what's going on with this. You get your headlines, not pushing them, but I do like the USA Today, like the 5 things, or the people that gives you the
5
top
bullet points.
Here's what's happening, and I don't need to hear your opinion about it. And so that's like with any other breaking news. Keep your arm's length, from the thing, and we don't respond to the current fever pitch when we built a portfolio intentionally to withstand things like this, because we know they're coming. You can get ahead of this.
Right. So let's just for grins. Let's talk about your most advisable investment strategy under various outcomes of the debt ceiling. So first of all, the most likely outcome is that this goes down to the wire in Washington, like it usually does, but eventually it gets resolved without a default. We've endured many of these in the past, and if you don't remember, it wasn't the end of days. It was scary, but it could be messy in the markets for the days leading up to this situation, for the last few days. But in the end, the best course of action in this lead up, like right now, is to, drum roll.
I bet you can guess what I'm going to say if you've been watching for any length of time.
I have no idea.
Staying invested in your carefully constructed, globally diversified investment portfolio structured for your personal financial goals and risk tolerances.
Right. So what if the negotiations in DC fail? What if we get the worst case scenario where the markets are in mayhem, we've defaulted on our debt, and what happens then? Well, we have these marvelously effective markets, capital markets, and they would respond by once again pricing in the good, bad, and the ugly news before we can successfully trade on them at all. And again, global diversification would be important, if not more critical. So selling in a panic of a situation like that, adjusting to the, in response to the worst news, would remain as ill-advised as it's been. You guys have worked with us for 30 some odd years. You know how this works. It's ill-advised to respond to that. So in other words, your best course of action would be to
stay invested in your carefully constructed, globally diversified investment portfolio structured for your personal goals and risk tolerance.
Well done, Angela. So now, last but not least, let's talk about what happens if Washington defies our doubts and achieves a happy and timely debt ceiling resolution, and everything goes along hunky-dory. I mean, the odds of that are
my money's on they're going to do it. You heard it here first.
Yeah. I mean, it could happen though, right?
Sure,
so what would happen then? In that case, the markets would likely respond to that news with better than expected performance. You probably see a jump in the markets because they are kind of a little, they may not be showing much up and down, but that's priced in a potential default.
Oh, sure.
So they would reward us for having stayed put in the markets. In that case, the best course of action would be
stay invested in your carefully constructed, globally diversified portfolio structured for your personal financial goals and risk tolerances.
Right. So, the thing about investing is you have to embrace and tolerate unexpected events. The world is full of them. There's no such thing as being invested in the capital markets and thinking it's going to be smooth sailing forever. You got to incorporate the fact that there's always going to be unexpected events happening, and you just can't prevent them. So staying the course is really advisable, because the reward for staying the course is you end up getting higher returns typically than you would get in safe money.
Right. That's why we
That's
invest
the
in the
thing.
first place. When we're taking on risk for
Right.
reward. If the risk wasn't present, you would never see 8 to 10% returns in stocks over time.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So that's that.
If you're worried about this in your own portfolio, please give us a call. We're happy to talk to you about it and calm the fears and get into more detail. If you
and
want.
see what if you may have some specific things going on that we're happy to work with you on. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. On to more exciting
good stuff.
Yes. All right. We are so excited to welcome Kelly Balamuth, an estate planning attorney located right here in Moraga. Her focus includes family protection, wealth preservation, and values-based planning, as well as planning strategies for unmarried couples and divorced individuals. Kelly graduated from UC Davis School of Law and joined her father's practice in Orinda in the same year, eventually taking over the practice and continuing to serve our local community. She has been named a super lawyer every year for over a decade and one of the top 50 women attorneys in Northern California by Super Lawyers for multiple years.
Wow.
I know, right? It keeps going. Hold on.
It gets better.
Avo.com has rated her a superb attorney with a 10 out of 10 rating. She is a member of the Wealth Council, a national organization of trust and estates attorneys, and other legal, tax, and business professionals who design sophisticated planning techniques for individuals and families. We are so lucky to have Kelly here today. Welcome to A Place of Possibility. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome.
I'm worried about the debt ceiling, but I'm
You weren't before we started talking.
Everything was fine before you got on here.
You actually calmed me down a little bit. So thank you.
Well, that didn't do it. Shoot. Well, so Kelly, I think we all know by now we need an estate plan. And I think the big question most people have is, when do I start one? What should be triggering me to re-examine my plan once I have one? And I think some of them will be kind of surprising to our viewers. You know, we're talking about things like marriage, birth or adoption of a child, or a new family member, a divorce, a retirement, a death, a shift in assets, or maybe a move to a new state or country.
Yeah. New country.
I mean, after this debt ceiling conversation, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Let's start looking at kayak.
Oh, man. Okay, let's start at the top. So a lot of single individuals these days are waiting longer to get married. We're seeing this. So we've got these single people who are 35. Should they be thinking about doing an estate plan at 35? Like, do single people need this?
Yeah. Most people think estate planning happens when you get old. As you're approaching your mortality, that's when people generally start thinking about estate planning. But truly, it's something that is good to start thinking about as soon as you're an adult. And part of the reason for that is that estate planning isn't just about what happens when you die. Most of us, hopefully, will die when we are old. We don't know when that's going to happen, though. We only know it's going to happen someday. So there is planning to be done when you're young, just because the unexpected might happen in that way. But more importantly, estate planning also includes planning for if you become incapacitated. So when you're single, think about, what would happen if you got hit by a car and ended up in the hospital? Who would make medical decisions for you? Who would you want to make those decisions for you? And if you don't make those choices, oftentimes it's only a judge that can make the choice for you, both for an advanced healthcare directive, which is an important part of an estate plan. That's who makes medical decisions, but also power of attorney says who can make my legal and financial decisions for me. So that would be like, who would pay your mortgage? Who would deal with government benefits if you have them? All sorts of legal and financial affairs. If you don't name those people and something happens to you, then you're requiring somebody to go to court on your behalf and try to get a judge to name somebody to do that for you. So when we create these documents ahead of time, you cut out an immense amount of trouble from the potential problems that might arise in your life. So for single people especially, I think it's important because you're alone in the world in some ways, and so to have somebody named that's there to step in if something happens to you. And also, frankly, to say what happens to your stuff when you die. If you don't make those choices, that ends up in court too. And your family members or whoever is inheriting from you has a long expensive court process to deal with. That if you,
I imagine.
you can solve that for them. So.
Yeah.
And so does this start at age 18? Like, I'm going off to college, I'm an adult, my parents can no longer make medical decisions for me. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's really one of the things that I counsel my clients to do when they have kids that are becoming adults, right? First of all, I have to say that your frontal cortex does not fully develop until you're 26 years old.
No
And
kidding.
That's where we know about cause and effect. So
Yeah.
just because your child turns into an adult at 18 doesn't necessarily mean they don't need you anymore or can't use your guidance. Right. But what happens when you turn 18 is you can no longer talk to doctors on their behalf or have any kind of access in that way. So I encourage my clients who have kids that are turning 18, going off to college, to have their kids create powers of attorney and advanced healthcare directives, ideally naming their parents, but they can really name whoever they want. Mm-hmm. And also a HIPAA release. A HIPAA release allows doctors to speak to the people you say they can speak to. Okay. And that way they go off to college, they get in a car accident, and you hear about it, you call the hospital. If you don't have those documents in place, you're probably going to hear, sorry, we can't talk to you. And you're not going to get any information. And your kids that's off in Wisconsin, you're lost.
Oh, how devastating.
Documents in place, you can talk to doctors and manage things for them, like paying rent and those sorts of things. So It is really important. I think maybe more for 18-year-olds than 26-year-olds in some ways.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Interesting. It sounds to me like this is something where the parents would say, we're going to pay for this to get done because you're certainly not going to do it.
I think
right?
I would.
You're 18 years old. And it's probably something that parents should be thinking about, right?
When I do it for 18-year-olds, it's always parents who are paying for it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
For the 18-year-olds.
Yeah. Maybe you're 30 and, you got a great job at a tech startup and now you've got a couple $1 million that, your sisters are going to fight over. At that point, you're really you're paying for your own estate plan, right?
Maybe even not then, though.
Tell our viewers, people ask me this all the time, I'm 30 and I'm single and I've got my 401k. Who's the default beneficiary? Is it my parents? Is it my sibling? Is it a court?
Yeah. So if you don't designate a beneficiary, it basically passes by what we call intestate succession, which is the order that it's like your nearest relative under the law. Okay. So if you pass away and you don't have kids and you don't have parents, it goes to sisters, then it goes and brothers, then to nieces and nephews, and it goes back up to the great grandparents and down their line. It's how people inherit from a long lost uncle that they never knew they had. That's intestate succession. So
that happened to my dad. He had an uncle in Vienna, Austria that he never spoke to. And we got a call from a lawyer a couple of years ago. My mom emails me, is this a joke? Is this real? I'm like, no, I remember that guy. This is real.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. What was I going to say about that? I lost it. Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
If it comes back, you let us know. What should newlyweds be thinking about in terms of their estate?
Yeah. Well, so same things as single people in that who's going to make medical decisions for you? Who's going to be able to handle your legal and financial affairs if something happens to you? Just because you're married doesn't mean that your spouse can serve in that position. Mm-hmm. And also just because you're married doesn't necessarily mean you'd want your spouse to serve in that position. So if you want them to, or you don't want them to, you need to have the documents making those decisions and putting those in writing legally. But also, when you're joining together, you want to make sure that you're sort of holding your assets in a way that makes sense and that you're deciding who would receive your assets when something happens to both of you. So if it's a first marriage, you might be thinking about having a trust together. A trust is kind of like, maybe I explain that for a minute. I think
that'd be great.
Know, but, so a will says what happens to your assets when you die, but a will, until you die, it's kind of a useless stack of papers. It doesn't do a thing. Mm-hmm. A trust is kind of like a will substitute. It says what happens to your stuff when you die. It also says what happens to your stuff if you become incapacitated. So a will, if you don't have a will or you do have a will and no trust, your assets have to pass through probate, which is the court process that's designed to pay your creditors and retitle your assets to your heirs. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like kind of an easy process, but it takes up to 2 years right now in California, and it costs about 5% of your total estate. It's a very expensive process. And while you're in that, your assets are largely locked up and so not available to to your
Interesting.
family or loved ones. So having a trust is like a will substitute, but it's like a private document. It doesn't have to go through probate. It's really an agreement that you have with yourself to do what you want to do with your assets when something happens to you. Either you become incapacitated or you die. So I like to think about a trust, and I describe it this way a lot, as like a suitcase that you put your assets in and carry them around with you. And so
I like that.
Yeah.
one thing that's really important and that I do that's a little bit different than what I gather a lot of estate planners do is when you create a trust, you're creating this suitcase and it says, okay, this is what's going to happen to the assets inside the suitcase. But when you first create it and you have your stack of documents and you sign off on it, your suitcase is empty. You have to do what's called funding your trust, which is moving your assets into the trust. So it's like retitling your real estate so that it's owned by the trust instead of by you personally. And same with your bank accounts. I review a lot of trusts for people. Sometimes they're 10, 15, 20 years old. And I say about 50% of the time, assets are not in the trust. So my understanding of what happens often is that a lot of estate planning attorneys will give you great instructions on what to do with your great trust. And then they go, bye, don't forget to do that.
Leave it to you to fund.
And people leave and then they just procrastinate till they forget because it's frankly not that exciting of a process to move your assets into the trust.
Or I talk to them, they think they're done. They think it's been done.
We did it.
They have no idea that it's not
Here's
done.
the trust.
Yeah. Then my lawyer took care of it.
So what do you do differently, or how do you help people ensure that they're not in that 50% doesn't bother?
I basically don't let them leave. I don't give them their trust.
The door, put chains across the door.
Yeah.
Sign all the deeds.
Yeah, that's good. That's smart.
Yeah, we do the real estate stuff for them. You can pay us extra and we will actually do the funding, but most people are totally capable of doing it on their own. And so we just follow up and make sure it gets done and, and basically keep gently poking and bothering people until it happens.
Good.
We need that sometimes.
Good. Yeah.
Well, speaking of marriage, I'm always going to ask this question, my favorite topic. What about premarital agreement?
Why would you ask that?
Should people do them?
Why would that be important?
Like, is it only when one partner is super duper wealthy and the other is super duper poor? Or would there be other reasons for doing prenup?
I've seen people do them when both have assets, Usually it happens with second marriages. Less likely with first marriages. With first marriages, if you, a lot of times people want to leave their child something, but not their child's spouse something. And when you inherit something while you're married, it's your separate property. So if you give something to your daughter when you die, it's hers alone. And as long as she doesn't mix it up with her husband's stuff, it stays separate. So when people have second marriages with kids from first marriages, they've got blended families. It becomes more important in that way because one thing that can happen if you don't think about estate planning in the proper way, and you don't take into the account the blended nature of the family, is that kids from first marriages could get left out. Right? If you don't plan, so I have children from a first marriage, I'm on my second marriage. And so I've planned for what happens when I die. My kids actually end up getting something at that point, rather than everything just going to my husband, which is how you might do it with a first marriage. And he has the same. So it just makes sure that people aren't forgotten, And so prenuptials are often used to make sure that the assets stay on the side of the family where they're supposed to stay.
That makes a lot of sense.
Smart. Yeah. So speaking of weddings, what after that, what comes next is children. Often.
First comes love.
For some people.
The baby.
So what impact does that have on your estate planning when children come along?
Yeah. Well, a variety of things. I mean, obviously you probably want to change who your heirs are. If you were leaving money, to your mom or your siblings or something, now you have a new person to think about. How you leave the money to them. If you're creating an estate plan, perhaps you have a trust that leaves money to your child, but your child's 2. And if something happens to you next year, you probably don't want them getting a $2 million check or, they can't get a $2 million check because they're 3.
What could go wrong?
Right. My 7-year-old would do really well with $2 million. Let me tell you, the Lego Ninjago sets would be all over the house.
Right.
It'd be great for the economy, I think.
It would be. It probably would be really great for Toy Story.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so you can structure in a trust how kids receive money. You can either say this is held in trust for them, and it can be held in trust for them for life in a way that they can grow the money over time and become eventually the trustee of their trust, and, build sort of like a legacy, build it over time. Or you can say, okay, when my child reaches this particular age, they receive their inheritance. Some people say, you get a third when you're 25, a third when you're 30, a third when you're 35, giving the child sort of a couple attempts to blow it, but still have something left. So, and those are ages that can be picked by who's ever doing it. But more importantly, when you have kids, it's time to name guardians. If something happens to you and you haven't named who will take care of your kids, then it's for a court to decide. And if, who knows what a court will do. Even when you name guardians, it's not for sure that the court will appoint the guardian that you name, but it's much more likely. And obviously, if you name somebody, they give a lot of deference to that. So naming long-term guardians for your kids is really important. It's something that's, some people struggle with. It's like, who do you name?
Of course.
Burden somebody, and I have a process I take people through that actually really clarifies it. Because you want to feel good about these choices. The other thing that I think is really important, and something that I do at my firm, I think it's a little bit unusual, is I actually put together an entire kids protection plan that includes not only naming long-term guardians, but also naming short-term guardians. I call them first responders, because if you think about a situation where, let's say you go out to dinner with your spouse and you leave your kid home with the high school babysitter and you don't make it home. Estate planners are always thinking about these horrible situations. I have to apologize. Pretend you go to dinner and you die on the way home.
You don't make it home.
I mean, this happens.
It happens.
Yes.
Of course it
Yeah.
does. Yeah.
And so then the babysitter, what's he or she going to do? Call the police probably when you don't get home at 10 and now it's 1. And then the police are going to come, and they're not going to have any choice but to take your kids into the custody of strangers, at least for a night or two, until they can find members or your guardian.
Like the CPS or whatever it is.
That is not in my estate plan, Kelly.
Yeah. So we create a kids protection plan, including short-term guardians being named. And then I give my clients little cards for their wallet with the names and phone numbers of those people. And I send the actual document to those people and encourage them to take a picture of it on their phone. That way, something happens, I can't guarantee this, but hopefully somebody finds the card, that person gets called, and then they can show up. I also name people within like 15 minutes of where you live. So it just kind of covers the gaps left by a will-only plan.
Yeah.
So in that situation, Kelly, when the parents die and they leave children, do you name a guardian, but what about, does the successor trustee just stay on forever and manage the money for those kids and make sure that the guardians have money, or do you appoint a guardian over the money too?
Yeah, exactly. The guardians and the trustees are separate. They can be the same person, but if they're not the same person, then the trustees managing the trust and the guardians are taking care of the children. And when they need money for soccer camp or, I don't know. Quinceanera clothes or something. They go to the trustee and say, "Hi, I need some money to help with this child." So
that's smart, because you might have this really loving couple or person that will take care of your children, but they're maybe not so great with money.
That's the case in my estate plan. My guardian is different from my trustee. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very common.
2 different skill sets, frankly.
Yeah.
Totally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Totally.
Well, from one really positive topic to the next, let's talk about what happens after you have kids and you stay up every night for 5 years straight. Now you hate each other and you get divorced. What do I need to do to my estate plan now that I no longer have a spouse?
Right. So while you're in the divorce, the problem with the divorce, let's say you created a trust with your soon-to-be ex-spouse. That trust, and when you start a divorce, you can't be moving assets around, right? The court won't let you move assets around. So your trust is going to stay like your trust is until your divorce is final. Okay. And by the way, if you die in the middle of your divorce, it's going to be as if you weren't going through a divorce as far as what happens to the assets in your trust.
Bummer.
But while you're in the divorce, the things you can change are your will, so that you can, anything that's outside the trust, you can say where that's going to go. Perhaps you typically when you have a trust, you have a will as well, and it tends to be a pour over will. And that's just kind of this backstop that we use in case you die with something outside of your trust. So let's say you create your trust, you put all your assets in it, and then the next year you buy a new house and you forget to put it in your trust. The pour over will take that house and pass it through probate and pour it into the trust. So that's what you have in general when you have a trust. But if you're in the middle of a divorce, you might not want that to happen to your separate property. If you have any separate property, you can create a will that says what happens to it. You can do that in the middle of the divorce.
Yeah.
Even more important, I think, is usually when you're getting divorced, you're not really excited about your future ex-spouse making medical decisions for you. Like something happens to you. Do you really want them to show up at the hospital?
Boy,
Whether
No.
that's probably the last person I'd want
Don't
to
look
have.
at me.
Yeah. Or your power of attorney. So,
Right.
we created your plan for you when you were married. Now you're getting divorced. You probably named your spouse as your first choice for power of attorney and
Sure.
your advanced healthcare directive. Now you probably want to change those choices. So you can redo those documents while you're in the middle of the divorce. That's a good idea to do that.
Gosh, it's making me think even the emergency contact on file at the hospital and at the
Yeah.
office, all those
Yeah.
things.
You know what I see happen all the time is people leave their former spouse as the beneficiary on their 401k or something at work, completely out of, they didn't, not even on their radar. And then they die. And
So
then
Kelly, what's the
ex-spouse is
precedent? Like,
getting it.
I'm divorced. I've redone my estate plan, but I accidentally left my ex-husband as the Benny on my 401k. Does my new trust win, or does my
Well,
401k
so
listed? Yeah.
when we create the trust, we create that suitcase and we put the real property in it and we put bank and brokerage accounts in it. And we actually put personal property in there as well. We don't put retirement or life insurance in the trust. Those get dealt with beneficiary designations. When I'm working with people, I'm working with all of those things because I want to make sure the beneficiary designations are working properly as well. So, your beneficiary designation, it happens the way it happens. So if it says my ex-spouse is my beneficiary, that's who's going to get your stuff.
Go change
it's
it.
important. It's very important to redo those. And also that
Sure.
brings up another thing having to do with kids. Something I see people do all the time, which is a big mistake, is to name minors as beneficiaries for retirement or life insurance. You don't want to ever have a minor on there. Because they're going to end up having to go to court, and then there's going to have to be somebody put in charge of those funds. It's not going to be your trustee because it's outside the trust.
Yeah.
So it's far better to, like with life insurance, we tend to have that pay to a trust, and then your trust says what happens to it. So
Yep. Interesting.
Thank you.
So this one surprised me. What is it about retirement that triggers a review in an estate plan? I didn't see that one coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just moving on with life. I mean, so for all of my clients, I reach out every 3 years. I basically send an email that says, has any of this long list of things happened in your life? Have you gotten married? Have you gotten divorced? Have you bought a house? Have you retired? Have you, lost a loved one? All of those things. And I check in with them about the law, because really estate planning, a lot of people want it to be just to do it once and forget it thing, where you do it, you throw it in a drawer, and then it lives there for 20 years.
Look at it 20 years or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is that, it needs to all work together over time. So oftentimes when we do a review, you don't need to make any changes at all. But retirement is just one of those other spots where we, want to look at everything. How are your assets held? Are your, retirement assets, now that you're starting to take, required minimum distributions or the like, do you need to change how they're being held? Who the beneficiaries are? Retirement, like just the act of actually retiring, it doesn't, you're not, oh, now I have to do guardians, or now I have to, there's not a new thing you necessarily need to do. It's just a really good time to check in, make sure it's all still working with your goals.
I think it's especially a time when your assets are moving around. Like maybe you had an employer stock program at your employer that you moved into a brokerage account when you retired at Charles Schwab.
Yeah.
And then you didn't put that brokerage account in the name of your trust. Like
Yeah.
you could see that happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So basically it's just trying it on to see if does this trust still fit me, or like, does this shirt still fit me? Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Okay,
Exactly.
good.
Have you gained weight?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Hopefully you gained wealth.
Right.
All right. So, moving on in the circle of life
Yeah,
now,
unfortunately.
my spouse has passed away. We retired, we traveled. It was wonderful. And now they're passed away. And I know there's a lot of things that need to happen in an estate transition. That's for another show. What do I now need to go back and do? Like, he's listed as a trustee on my trust. What do I do?
Right. So You know, when we're naming trustees and we're naming beneficiaries on accounts and we're naming people who can manage you under a power of attorney, advanced healthcare directive, my preference is always to have multiple choices, right? So typically people name their spouse first and then they have one or two choices. And if that's the case, you don't actually have to do anything with regard to those choices because the other person is just there. That said, it's a good idea to, go in and look at everything. If you had a trust together, that is going to be being administered. And then usually when you have a trust, it says, okay, when my spouse dies, these assets stay in trust for me in a particular way. And so it's a matter of making sure that that is coming into being the new way that you're going to be holding the assets. But also, you might want to be making changes to who your choices are. It's not like a house on fire kind of situation as long as you have other people listed. Yeah. So when your spouse dies, again, it's a good idea to check in and make sure it's all.
Okay.
People ask us this all the time. It's the Joe and Jane Smith Living Trust. Joe passes away. Does Jane Smith need to change the name of the trust at all? Or can Jane Smith keep on going with Joe's name in there and Joe listed as a trustee? People ask this all the time.
It really depends on what the trust says.
Lawyer answered.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Lawyer answered.
I was waiting for it.
How many times a day do you say that?
No, we got really far in this show without hearing it depends. I'm proud.
Yeah. So, typically the foundational estate plan that we're preparing for people, if they're not doing like advanced tax planning or the like, it includes what's called a revocable trust, also known as revocable. And that's a trust that's really flexible. There's three hats that are worn with regard to any trust. There's the grantor, it's also known as the settlor, and that's who makes the trust. And then there's the trustee, that's who's like the boss of the trust, managing whatever's in there. And then there's the beneficiary, that's who receives the benefits of the trust. And while you're alive, when you create a revocable trust, you wear all three of those hats. You're the one who created it, you're the trustee, and you're the beneficiary. And because of that, it's really flexible. You can make changes to the trust. You can move assets in or out of it. There's no limitations in how you interact with it. Oftentimes among spouses, I'm getting back to your question. Oftentimes among spouses, it'll say, okay, we have a revocable trust. And when I die, everything just kind of stays in this revocable trust for the surviving spouse. And he or she can make any changes to it and amend it, do whatever they want. That's pretty common. If that's the case, then not that much needs to be done when the spouse dies. If, on the other hand, it says, when I die, half of the community property and all of my separate property is going to go into a marital trust that's basically protected from creditors and kind of protected from the surviving spouse, and to make sure that passes on to my descendants. If that's the case, then there is kind of more documents that definitely need to be made. So it really depends on what the structure is.
Pull it out, read it, call the lawyer.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Rinse and repeat. Yeah. So the next topic we were going to ask, it really needs more time than what we have. So, but I would just say to our audience that if your estate is approaching $13 million per person, that's how much you can pass on, almost that without an estate tax. You need to start calling someone like Kelly right away, because there's things that Kelly can do for you that would help you to reduce your estate tax liability. It's a really important thing, because the tax rate is 40% above that, correct?
Right. Yeah. Right. So right now our estate tax exemption is just under 13 million.
Right.
So it's 13 million per person. So if you're married, you really kind of have 26 million. That number is set to sunset. That's higher than it's really ever been. It's going to drop down. I think it's January 2026. It's going to drop down to 5 million adjusted for inflation. So we're expecting it to be around 6 to 7 million, unless the legislature does something to change that.
Yeah.
So it's always, this thing is always a moving target.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We were going to talk about, moving states or countries. I think the answer is probably yes. But for what reason? Like, I moved to Oregon. Do I need to change my trust that I made in California?
You need to have your trust reviewed. And it really depends on what state you're moving to. We're a community property state. If you move to a state that's not a community property state, you're more likely to have to make changes to your trust. It really just depends on the state. And if you move out of the country, the you can't have it. You need to be dealing with an attorney in that country. You know, I've
Mhm.
never actually done an estate plan that sort of melds two countries, but in order to do that, it's a lot. You have to, you know, have consultants on both sides of whatever ocean or boundary
Yeah.
line you're dealing with. Um,
So is it,
typically we're not putting like foreign assets in an American trust or vice
Yeah.
versa.
okay. Yeah. So basically you really want to get a different trust or whatever, a different kind of vehicle.
Well, maybe
Otherwise you run into all kinds of legal problems, I'm guessing, if you died.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good.
Right.
Kelly, I wish we could talk to you longer.
I
This is so
know.
great. I mean, you're so clear about the way you describe things and understandable. I think our audience is really going to appreciate it, and we're going to cut this up into little reels and stuff,
Anything,
and it'll
Kelly.
be really useful.
Kelly does something that I haven't seen other estate planning attorneys do, and I think it would be great for our listeners to know. Can you talk a little bit about what you do from the legacy piece, where you're interviewing the?
Oh yeah.
Thanks for
Thinkers.
asking me. Yeah, thanks for asking me about that. You know, we're more than our stuff. You want your estate plan to deal with your assets in a perfect way. You don't want there to be any problems with that, but it really doesn't take into account that, you know, your real legacy. Nobody's mom dies and then they take their will and frame it and put it next to their bed to remember your mom died. Like, that's not what happens. So
I better hide mine then.
I try to acknowledge that with my clients, the ones who let me, and most do. I do a videotaped interview with them at the end of our process. We talk about their values, their stories, their experiences, their kids, if they have them, you know, and it just becomes, I tell most people, like, ideally, you'll look at this in 10 years and marvel at how young and beautiful you were, you know, but if you're not there, it's a really nice thing to leave behind. It's just a little piece of you, really.
I wish I had that for
That's really
the
great.
grandparents I've
That's really
lost.
great.
That
That's really
would be
great.
priceless.
So stay on with us for a minute after we close, okay? We'd like to talk to you. Thank you so much, Kelly. We really appreciate it. For those of you that are listening, Kelly Balamuth can be reached at 925-254-1234. I can't believe you got
Best
that phone number.
ever.
You are so lucky. That is a good one. And your website is lamarindalegal.com. Right. Okay. See, I still got it. Call me old guy all the time.
Occasionally. Kelly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Okay, everyone. That wraps it up for today. As always, if you have questions or comments, you can send them to us at info@aplaceofpossibility.com. We also love topic ideas. Send those over. If you want to book an appointment with us to review, maybe you're worried about the debt ceiling, we'd be happy to chat with you. Yeah. You can click on the link to schedule a meeting with us, either on your screen or the show notes. And we are also offering a free copy of the ebook, The Investment Answer. This is a fantastic overview of science-based investing. It's really easy to read, and it's the philosophy that we use here at DelMonte Group. If you want to learn more on your own, go check that out.
Yep. Definitely.
Thank you for being here with us today.
Yes. So thanks very much. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And we have another guest then, don't we?
I think so.
I think so too. We don't know who it is.
Check
right
it.
No, we do. We do.
Someone knows somewhere.
Anyway, thank you very much for being with us. And remember, until next time, you're invested and so are we. We appreciate you. Thanks a lot. Take care.